When incest produces fatal syndromes, the consequences span generations and devastate entire families. This was nowhere more clear than in the isolated mountains of eastern Kentucky, where the Harlan family's history lay buried for decades until its exposure in 1967. The Appalachian hills, with their thick forests and deep valleys, provided the perfect refuge for communities wishing to remain apart from society. Upon these steep slopes, about 50 kilometers from the nearest town, resided the Harlan family, a lineage tracing back to the region's first European settlers in the 1700s. Dr. Robert Caldwell, a rural physician serving Kentucky's most remote communities, became the first to document the case. In his own words, preserved in his medical journal, he wrote, "In my 35 years of medicine, I have never witnessed such a concentration of congenital anomalies within one family. The Harlans appeared to bear the burden of generations of consanguineous unions. Their property was reachable only by a narrow dirt road carved into the mountain. Visitors were scarce, and the family shunned outsiders. When Dr. Caldwell first arrived at the property, answering an urgent call about a child with breathing trouble, he was unprepared for what awaited him. The main house was a worn, two-story wooden structure, surrounded by smaller huts scattered across the land. In total, 32 individuals lived within that family compound. The patriarch, Jacob Harlan, was 68 years old in 1967 and wore a perpetually severe expression. His wife Margaret was also his first cousin. Yet it was the third generation that revealed the true toll of consanguinity. Of Jacob and Margaret's 9 children, 7 had married their cousins. From these unions came 23 children, 17 of whom had serious developmental issues. Dr. Caldwell immediately noted the distinctive traits: prominent jaws, eyes set very close together, fused fingers, and, in many cases, severe intellectual disability. The most severe case was Timothy, a 12-year-old boy with Apert syndrome, a rare condition marked by craniofacial malformations and syndactyly. Timothy was the son of 2 first cousins, Samuel and Ruth Harlan. The boy struggled to breathe and endured constant pain from intracranial pressure caused by the premature fusion of his skull bones. The family's geographical isolation was just the beginning. Over generations, their social isolation had become absolute. Jacob Harlan ruled his family with an iron fist, discouraging any contact with the outside world. The children did not attend school. Modern medicine was viewed with suspicion, and marriages were arranged within the family circle. "We preserve our lineage," Jacob told Dr. Caldwell on that first visit. "Pure blood, without contamination from the outside." The doctor soon realized he was confronting an unprecedented case of genetic isolation. Meticulously, he began recording each family member, their kinship ties, and medical conditions, creating what would become one of the most significant case studies on the effects of consanguinity in American medical history. Yet what began as a medical case soon widened into a broader investigation. Local authorities, alerted by Dr. Caldwell's preliminary report, began questioning whether the children were being denied essential medical care and compulsory education. In June 1967, social workers visited the property, accompanied by the local sheriff. What they discovered was described as medieval conditions. Children with more severe disabilities were kept in separate rooms, some tied to beds to prevent self-injury. Medical records were non-existent, and several children had never been formally registered. The case quickly captured local media attention. The Louisville Courier-Journal ran a front-page story titled "The Forgotten Family of the Mountains," detailing the dire conditions and genetic anomalies found among the Harlans. The report avoided sensationalism but underscored the severity of the situation. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss any of the most impactful cases of genetic isolation ever documented in American history. Your subscription supports our continued investigation into these hidden stories that shaped communities and warn of the real dangers of consanguinity. The Harlan story did not begin in 1967. To fully grasp how a family reached such a degree of genetic isolation, we must return to the late 18th century when the first Harlans arrived in the Kentucky mountains. Ezekiel Harlan, a Scottish-Irish immigrant, settled in the region around 1795, fleeing what he called the corruption of eastern cities. He purchased 200 acres of mountainous land, built a log cabin, and raised his family far from an expanding society's gaze. County historical records show Ezekiel married his first cousin, Hannah, establishing a cultural pattern not uncommon at the time, especially among isolated communities. In the rural, isolated communities of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, cousin marriage was not just accepted but often encouraged to keep property within families. Local historian Martin Thornbury, who has extensively studied Appalachian isolated communities, explains, these early settler families faced a reality very different from our own. Geographic isolation meant a limited pool of potential marriage partners, and economic considerations often prevailed that are completely foreign to us now. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, deepened the Harlans' isolation further. While Kentucky officially remained in the Union, the region was deeply divided. The Harlans, with their distrust of government authority, retreated even deeper into the mountains during this turbulent period. It is during this time that the diaries of Josiah Harlan, Ezekiel's great-grandson, offer a rare window into the family mindset. In an entry dated 1863, he wrote, "The world outside is shattering in war and madness. Here in the mountains, we preserve our way of life, our lineage, our traditions. We are the last guardians of the true American spirit." This rhetoric of purity and preservation became central to the Harlan identity. With each generation, isolation became not just geographical but ideological. Children were taught from an early age that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous, and that the family's survival depended on their unity, literally. The 1880 census records 18 Harlans living on the original property, now expanded to 320 acres. 15 bore the Harlan surname, suggesting intrafamily marriages were already commonplace. The census also notes 3 children listed as infirm, though the nature of their conditions was unspecified. The turn of the century brought dramatic changes to rural America, but impacted the Harlans little. While roads, telephones, and eventually electricity reached increasingly remote communities, the family deliberately remained apart. A 1948 Kentucky Electric Company report mentions the Harlans refused installation of power lines on their property, preferring to continue with kerosene lamps. This technological isolation reinforced their social isolation. Without radios or newspapers, the family remained disconnected from world events, the Great Depression, 2 World Wars. These transformative historical episodes barely touched the Harlans' closed universe. It was in the 1930s that Jacob Harlan, the patriarch Dr. Caldwell would encounter decades later, assumed family leadership. Under his direction, the rules of intrafamily marriage grew even stricter. Local church documents show he formally withdrew his family from the Baptist congregation in 1935 after a sermon where the pastor spoke against marriages between close relatives. Jacob developed his own religious interpretation based on selective Bible readings and family tradition. This homespun religion emphasized lineage purity and cast the Harlans as a chosen people tasked with preserving values the rest of the world had abandoned. The family's isolation grew so complete that during the 1950s polio vaccination campaign, health officials were unaware many Harlan children even existed. Only years later, after the 1967 intervention, was it discovered that at least 2 children in the family had died of polio, a disease preventable by the Salk vaccine, available since 1955. By the 1960s, generations of isolation had created the perfect conditions for dangerous genetic concentration. Isolation was no longer just a cultural or geographical choice, it was inscribed in the Harlan family's very DNA. When Dr. Robert Caldwell began systematically documenting the Harlans' medical conditions in 1967, he was unknowingly contributing to an emerging medical field, population genetics. His meticulous records, preserved today at the University of Kentucky, offer one of the most complete case studies on the biological effects of prolonged consanguinity. What we observed in the Harlan family is not simply an isolated case of cousin marriage, but the cumulative result of generations of consanguinity, explained Dr. Eleanor Simmons, a Johns Hopkins University geneticist who studied the case in the 1970s. It is like watching centuries of compressed genetic evolution in just a few generations. To understand what happened to the Harlans, we must examine genetics fundamentals. Each person carries 2 copies of every gene, one from each parent. Many defective genes are recessive. Their effects manifest only when a person inherits two copies of the defective gene, one from each parent. In genetically diverse populations, the chance of two partners carrying the same defective recessive gene is relatively low. But when close relatives have children, this probability increases dramatically, as they share a significant portion of their genetic material. First-degree cousins share roughly 12.5% of their genes. When they marry, the likelihood their children inherit two copies of the same defective recessive gene is far greater than in the general population. When this pattern repeats over generations, as with the Harlans, the result is an accumulating concentration of deleterious recessive genes. Among the Harlan children, Dr. Caldwell documented a striking array of rare genetic conditions. Beyond Timothy's Apert syndrome, there were cases of polydactyly, extra fingers or toes, in 6 children, syndactyly, fused fingers, in 4, retinitis pigmentosa, a degenerative retinal disease leading to blindness, in 3 adolescents, cleft palate in 5, and varying degrees of intellectual disability in 14. Particularly remarkable was the case of identical twins James and John Harlan, born in 1955. Both had a rare form of disproportionate dwarfism known as spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia. This condition, characterized by a short trunk and limbs and spinal problems, is caused by mutations in the COL2A1 gene, which codes for type II collagen, an essential protein for bone and cartilage development. These twins represent one of the clearest cases of recessive genetic expression I have observed, Dr. Caldwell noted. Their condition is so rare that the likelihood of it occurring by chance in a non-consanguineous population would be virtually nil. The impact of consanguinity extended beyond visible physical conditions. Subsequent study of the Harlan medical records revealed abnormally high rates of congenital heart disease, kidney issues, and rare metabolic disorders. The family's average life expectancy was significantly lower than the national average, just 47 years for men and 51 for women, at a time when U.S. life expectancy exceeded 70 years. One of the most alarming findings came when Dr. Caldwell examined the family's own unofficial birth records. Of 49 documented pregnancies between 1945 and 1967, 14 ended in miscarriage, 7 in stillbirth, and 3 in neonatal death within the first weeks. These figures represent a pregnancy loss rate 3 times the national average of the era. Can you imagine the silent suffering of these women? Losing child after child without access to proper medical care, believing these tragedies were simply God's will. Leave a comment saying what a preventable tragedy to show how genetic education could have saved so many lives. The phenomenon observed in the Harlans has a scientific name: inbreeding depression. This term describes the reduction in a population's biological fitness resulting from the accumulation of harmful genetic traits due to breeding between genetically similar individuals. In her definitive report on the family, published in the American Journal of Medical Genetics in 1973, Dr. Simmons wrote, "The Harlans represent an involuntary natural experiment on the effects of prolonged consanguinity. The genetic consequences observed in this family offer undeniable evidence of the biological risks of close-kin mating across multiple generations." She continued, "Particularly notable is the prevalence of conditions that typically occur at frequencies of less than 1 in 100,000 in the general population. In the Harlan family, we find multiple cases of these conditions within a group of just 32 individuals. For the Harlans, these were not abstract statistics but daily lived reality." Elizabeth Harlan, one of the few adults who cooperated extensively with researchers, described growing up knowing something was wrong with her family without understanding what. "We always knew we were different," she told Dr. Caldwell. "The way people in town looked at us on the rare times we went, the other children's laughter. Jacob said it was because we were special, chosen. I only realized later it was because we were sick." The discovery of the Harlan family in 1967 triggered a series of government interventions that would forever transform that isolated community. The case rapidly escalated from a medical concern to a child welfare matter, sparking debate over the boundaries between religious freedom, parental rights, and child protection. In July 1967, a month after social workers' first visit, the Kentucky Department of Child Services obtained a temporary court order to examine all Harlan children under 18. Jacob Harlan's resistance was fierce. "No one will take my grandchildren," he told the sheriff. "God gave us these children to care for and our traditions." The operation to remove the children for medical evaluation required several state police officers. Witnesses described heart-wrenching scenes of frightened children separated from parents. For many, it was their first time leaving the family property. At the Kentucky Regional Hospital, specialists confirmed Dr. Caldwell's preliminary diagnoses and uncovered additional, untreated conditions. Timothy, the boy with Apert syndrome, underwent immediate surgery to relieve pressure on his brain. 3 other children were diagnosed with congenital heart defects requiring surgical intervention. The case quickly became a legal test. In August 1967, the county juvenile court held a custody hearing lasting 5 days. Experts in medicine, social work, and law testified about conditions on the Harlan property. Attorney Margaret Williams, assigned to represent the Harlan children, argued, these children were deprived not only of adequate medical care, but of the fundamental right to education and the opportunity to develop as individuals. The isolation imposed on them is not merely physical, it represents a form of emotional and intellectual neglect. The family's defense, led by local attorney Thomas Shepard, countered that the government was improperly interfering with a private religious community simply wishing to live by its traditions. The Harlan family represents a disappearing American way of life, Shepard argued. They have a constitutional right to raise their children according to their religious beliefs. Judge William Harrison faced a dilemma echoing broader tensions in 1960s American society, the balance between individual rights and collective responsibility. His decision, delivered on September 12, 1967, set a significant legal precedent. While this court recognizes parents' fundamental right to raise children according to their religious beliefs, Judge Harrison stated, this right is not absolute when it endangers the children's physical and mental well-being. The evidence presented convincingly demonstrates that the Harlan family's endogamous marriage practices have resulted in significant genetic harm to the children, and that the refusal to seek proper medical treatment constitutes neglect. The court ruled that 17 of the 23 Harlan children be placed under temporary state custody for medical treatment and educational assessment. Children with less severe medical conditions could return to their parents after implementing a supervision plan including regular medical visits and school enrollment. The decision sparked protests from conservative religious groups and individual freedom advocates. The Harlan case became a focal point in national debates over government intervention in family life. Letters to the editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal revealed deeply divided public opinion. What happened to the Harlan family is nothing less than government tyranny disguised as compassion, wrote a reader from Frankfort, Kentucky. Another from Lexington countered, if we continue to allow personal belief to override scientific evidence, how many more children will suffer unnecessarily? For the Harlans themselves, the consequences were immediate and traumatic. The family unit that had persisted for over 150 years was fractured. Jacob Harlan, who had ruled with unquestioned authority, saw his world crumble. 3 weeks after the court ruling, he suffered a stroke and died 5 days later. The Harlan children, many of whom had never interacted with outsiders, faced immense adaptation challenges. Mary Harlan, no relation, a social worker assigned to the case, documented, the Harlan children exhibit extreme separation anxiety and difficulty adapting to new environments. Many show significant social developmental delays, with communication and interaction patterns reflecting their prolonged isolation. Particularly moving was the case of siblings Sarah and Michael Harlan, ages 8 and 10. Both had moderate intellectual disability and had never been separated. Placed in different foster homes due to their specific medical needs, they developed severe regressive behaviors requiring intensive psychological intervention. For some older children, integration into the outside world brought a mix of trauma and liberation. Elizabeth Harlan, then 16, wrote in a diary later included in the case records, "Everything is frightening and strange. The lights are too bright. People talk too fast. But for the first time, I am learning things Jacob would never let us know. Yesterday, a nurse explained to me why so many babies in our family are born sick or die. It isn't God's punishment. Nearly 6 decades after the Harlan family's discovery, their case continues to influence medicine, law, and social ethics. The legacy of this family from the Kentucky mountains extends far beyond their individual circumstances, offering valuable lessons for contemporary society. Of Jacob Harlan's 23 children and grandchildren living on the property in 1967, we can now trace remarkably diverse life paths. Timothy, the boy with Apert syndrome whose condition first drew Dr. Caldwell's attention, underwent surgery and received ongoing treatment. Though he never fully overcame his physical and cognitive limitations, he lived to age 47, far longer than would have been possible without intervention. He died in 2002 from cardiac complications related to his condition. The twins, James and John Harlan, with disproportionate dwarfism, followed surprisingly different paths. John, adopted by a Louisville family with resources for specialized care, received adapted education and eventually graduated high school. He worked as an accountant for many years and became an advocate for disability rights. James, who remained closer to the original community, had less access to treatments and educational opportunities, illustrating how environment can profoundly influence development even when genetics impose significant challenges. Sarah Harlan, one of the youngest children at the time of intervention, perhaps represents the most inspiring story. Adopted by a family of university professors, she overcame initial developmental delays and eventually earned a degree in social work. In a remarkable turn, Sarah dedicated her career to working with isolated Appalachian communities, helping bring reproductive and genetic health education to populations that, like her biological family, remained on the margins of modern society. "I carry the Harlans not only in my DNA, but in my life's mission," Sarah stated in a rare 2005 interview for a documentary on the case. "Every community I help connect with medical and educational resources represents a family like mine that can be spared unnecessary suffering." Medically, the Harlan case advanced understanding of recessive genetic diseases. The extensive genetic mapping of the family, begun in the 1970s and continued with advanced technologies in subsequent decades, helped researchers identify specific genes associated with various rare conditions. Dr. Jennifer Lowe, a geneticist at the University of Kentucky Medical Center, explains, "The meticulous records kept on the Harlan family have allowed us to track the inheritance of specific genetic mutations across multiple generations. This type of longitudinal study is extremely rare and valuable, offering insights unobtainable any other way." In 1989, researchers using preserved family DNA samples identified a specific mutation in the FGFR2 gene responsible for Timothy's Apert syndrome. This discovery later contributed to better prenatal diagnostics and early interventions for children born with this condition. Legally, Harlan v. Commonwealth of Kentucky set important precedents on the limits of family autonomy when it conflicts with child welfare. Cited in over 40 subsequent cases involving isolated religious communities, Judge Harrison's decision continues to influence the legal balance between religious freedom and child protection. The original Harlan property, subject of legal dispute for years, was eventually divided among several heirs. The main house, where Jacob Harlan once ruled his small, isolated kingdom, was abandoned in the 1980s and destroyed by fire in 1992. Today, only stone foundations remain, slowly being reclaimed by the forest, a physical reminder of a vanished way of life that endured for nearly 2 centuries. The ethical implications of the Harlan case remain relevant in the 21st century. With advanced genetic technologies and consumer DNA testing, issues of genetic counseling, privacy, and reproductive autonomy have gained new urgency. The Harlan case reminds us that scientific knowledge must be democratized, argues Dr. Michael Sanderson, a University of Chicago bioethicist. When vital information about genetic health remains concentrated only among the privileged and educated, we perpetuate a system where some communities remain vulnerable to harmful patterns that could be prevented. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Harlan legacy is how it illuminates the tension between tradition and progress, between cultural preservation and individual well-being. In isolated communities that still exist worldwide, from closed religious groups to geographically remote populations, the balance between respecting traditions and protecting against potentially harmful practices remains a challenge. The Harlan story is not simply about the biological dangers of consanguinity, but about how isolation, geographic, educational, and ideological, can create cycles of suffering that span generations. Simultaneously, it is a story of human resilience and the capacity to adapt even after generations of seclusion. In 2015, the University of Kentucky inaugurated the Harlan Center for Population Genetic Studies, dedicated to researching rare genetic diseases and developing outreach programs for isolated rural communities. Partially funded by an anonymous donation, believed to be from a family descendant, the center aims to transform a legacy of suffering into a resource for prevention and education. If you've watched this far, it's because this story resonates with you. Leave a comment saying watched here so I can get to know you and see who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of the most impactful cases revealing the hidden consequences of social and genetic isolation. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories that educate and warn about real dangers that can lurk within isolated communities. Don't forget to like and share this video with anyone you think would find this compelling piece of American medical history compelling. The Harlan case remains a powerful reminder that scientific knowledge, when accessible to all, holds the power to free entire communities from cycles of preventable suffering. In Sarah Harlan's words, "My family's true tragedy was not the genes we shared, but the information we never had access to. That knowledge would have been our salvation." Today, looking back on the Harlan history, we see not just a family tragedy, but a microcosm reflecting broader questions about how societies navigate the balance between tradition and scientific progress. In a world where isolated communities still exist, where ancient beliefs sometimes clash with modern knowledge, the Harlan legacy reminds us of our collective responsibility to ensure life-saving knowledge is available to everyone, no matter how far they may be from centers of power and education. The story ends, but its lessons endure, echoing through generations as a call for compassion, understanding, and the democratization of knowledge that can break cycles of silent suffering.